The desert had a way of silencing everything: hopes, voices, even the sense of time itself. When Daniel Hayes crawled out from beneath the flipped chassis of his Jeep, he didn't yet understand that he had entered a place where nature played by different rules, none of them forgiving. Sand stretched in every direction, unbroken and merciless, glowing beneath a sun so white and violent that it seemed to swallow the sky. His vehicle, once his lifeline, now lay mangled and useless, its shattered windshield glittering like broken ice across the burning ground. The crash had happened in a heartbeat: a blown tire, a violent jerk of the steering wheel, a roll that tossed his world like a toy in the hands of an unseen giant. When he staggered to his feet, dizzy and bleeding, one truth struck him deeper than any wound. No one knew where he was. The nearest sign of civilization was more than 70 kilometers away. His phone was dead. His water jug had burst in the crash. And the desert didn't care about his plans, his schedule, or the people waiting for him. It cared only about taking. That first moment of clarity, standing alone with scorched wind slicing across his face, marked the beginning of the hardest 9 days of his life. A trial that would push him past every limit he believed he had. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the panic and the pain, Daniel understood that the desert would demand a price for every hour he managed to stay alive. Before we go any further into this testimony of survival, faith, and the unseen hand of God, I want to invite you to become part of this growing family of believers who gather here every week to hear stories that strengthen the heart and remind us that the Lord never abandons His children. If you haven't subscribed yet, take a moment now to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the powerful stories we share. Your support helps this message reach more people who might be needing encouragement, hope, or a reminder that God is still working miracles in the darkest corners of the earth. And if this story is already touching your heart, please leave a like. It truly makes a difference. At first, Daniel tried to stay calm, convincing himself that someone would eventually come down the lonely stretch of road where he'd last been seen. But as the hours dragged on and the sunlight grew harsher, the reality became impossible to ignore. He had walked that road only once before, and he remembered how vast and empty it was, how cars could go hours without passing another soul. Now, stranded far from any visible path, he was nothing more than a dot, swallowed by a landscape of heat and silence. His thirst began creeping in before the sun even reached its peak. It wasn't gentle. It came as a tightening in the throat, a heaviness in the tongue, a pounding headache that pulsed behind his eyes. Dehydration wasn't a distant threat. It was already happening. By evening, his lips had cracked and his voice had thinned into a rasp. His body was shedding moisture faster than he could understand, and the desert seemed to take pleasure in extracting every drop. In desperation, he crawled back to the wrecked Jeep, searching for anything that might save him: an old bottle, a forgotten drink, even a can of soup. Nothing. The world around him faded into a blur of heat, shimmering off endless dunes. It was then, trembling and helpless, that Daniel realized he wasn't waiting for rescue anymore. He was waiting to die, unless he did something drastic, something instinctual and raw. The desert had given him no choices, so he would have to create his own. As the second day dawned, a pale red smear rising over the dunes, Daniel felt his body weakening at a pace that terrified him. He had been dehydrated before in his life, but never like this. His sweat didn't feel like sweat anymore. It felt like his body was leaking its life away. His hands trembled violently. His vision flickered at the edges, darkening in and out like a failing camera. He knew he couldn't survive long without water. Every bone in his body screamed for it. Every cell demanded it. And so, driven by an instinct older than reason, Daniel did something he never imagined he'd have the will, or desperation, to consider. He tied his shirt around his torso and let the rising heat force sweat into the fabric. Then, trembling with disgust and necessity, he wrung the cloth into his mouth. The taste was salty, metallic, almost nauseating, but the instant it touched his tongue, his mind sharpened just slightly, and he felt a single drop of life returning to him. It wasn't enough to hydrate him properly, not even close, but it slowed the collapse. It bought him minutes, maybe hours, enough to think, enough to search, enough to survive one more brutal sunrise. It was a decision that stripped him of comfort, pride, and the illusion of control. But in that moment, he understood something powerful. Survival had no dignity. It had only instinct. And instinct whispered that if he didn't replenish every drop his body lost, he would be dead by nightfall. So Daniel did it again. And again. And again, as the desert waited patiently, certain that 9 days was far too long for a man to fight. By the 5th day, Daniel no longer recognized his own body. His skin had peeled in layers, blistering and cracking like old paint under a blowtorch. His eyes sank deep into their sockets, ringed in red from heat and exhaustion. He moved slowly, deliberately, because every step felt like it cost him something valuable. The sun was no longer an enemy. It was an executioner performing its duty hour by hour. The nights were no kinder. Though cooler, they were filled with a cold that cut through his weakened frame, causing him to shiver violently beneath the warped metal of the jeep. Coyotes sometimes circled at a distance, their silhouettes flickering like ghosts along the horizon. They kept their distance, but Daniel knew they were waiting for something. Waiting for him to fall. On the 6th morning, he tried to walk toward what he thought was the direction of the highway, but after an hour, he collapsed in the sand, his legs refusing to carry him further. His mind drifted in and out, memories of his childhood, the smell of rain, the comfort of cold water flowing from a tap. All of it felt unreal, like dreams belonging to someone else. He crawled back to the jeep, using what remaining strength he had. Each time he squeezed sweat from the fabric into his mouth, he imagined it buying him one more hour, one more breath, one more chance. But even as he fought, he began to understand that survival in the desert wasn't about strength or endurance. It was about surrendering to the hardest truth of all. Sometimes, survival meant doing things you would never speak of again. On the 9th morning, Daniel could no longer feel his legs. His arms shook uncontrollably. His heartbeat fluttered with frightening irregularity. He had stopped sweating, which meant his body had entered the final stages of dehydration, where the absence of moisture became a warning sign that death was closing in. He lay beneath the jeep, staring up at a sky so blue it felt surreal, almost mocking. He thought of giving up, letting the sand bury him, letting silence swallow his name. But then he heard it, a low hum, faint at first, almost imagined, a vehicle. He slowly lifted his head. There, in the distance, kicking up a thin trail of dust, was a white pickup truck. He forced himself onto his elbows, pain tearing through his ribs. He waved his arm once, twice. The truck didn't slow. Panic washed over him. With everything left in his body, he tore a piece of fabric from his shirt, lifted it high, and swung it toward the sky. This time, the truck braked. Dust curled around it like a halo. A figure stepped out, running toward him. And in the moment before his consciousness faded, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in 9 days. Something so overwhelming it brought tears to his burned eyes. He wasn't going to die here. He had survived the desert. He had survived his own fear. And he had survived the kind of choices that leave a mark on the soul forever. When people talk about survival, they often imagine adventure, something thrilling, almost glamorous, like scenes cut from a movie. But real survival, the kind lived by those who never expected to face death so closely, isn't glorious at all. It's raw, desperate, and pushed forward by instincts buried deep within the human mind. Daniel Hayes was never a survival expert. He wasn't a seasoned hiker or a trained soldier. He was an ordinary man taking a simple drive through a desert stretch in the American Southwest. A shortcut, he thought, to shave an hour off his trip. He had no reason to fear the road ahead. No reason to imagine his jeep flipping and rolling until it skidded to a stop upside down. No reason to believe that his life, as he knew it, would hinge on decisions so primal and unthinkable that he would struggle to speak about them later. But that is the truth of survival. It arrives without warning. It tears away comfort and illusion and leaves a person face to face with the most ancient part of themselves, the part that refuses to die. And in Daniel's case, it all began with something deceptively simple: thirst. Dehydration is one of the fastest killers the desert has at its disposal. Under temperatures that burn above 45 degrees C, the human body stops working correctly in a matter of hours. Sweat evaporates instantly. Muscles stiffen. Thoughts grow cloudy. Every step becomes a decision between conserving energy and fighting collapse. Most people underestimate how quickly dehydration can spiral into hallucination, panic, and organ failure. Daniel didn't have that luxury. From the moment his water jug burst during the crash, he was thrust into a race against his own biology. He checked the Jeep again and again, opening compartments he had already searched, hoping something might magically appear. Nothing did. His phone was destroyed. The nearest town was nearly 50 miles behind him, and the desert had swallowed his tracks so completely that even he couldn't retrace the route he came from. That first night, he lay under the flipped vehicle, staring into darkness that felt too still, too endless, wondering how quickly a person could die of thirst. He didn't know the exact answer, but the desert was prepared to teach him. Daniel didn't want to be remembered as the man who resorted to such extremes. He didn't want to picture himself wringing sweat out of a shirt just to feel a few drops of moisture touch his tongue. But on the second day, when the sun rose with that unforgiving white glare, he realized he didn't care about dignity anymore. Survival wasn't about pride. It wasn't about what sounded acceptable or reasonable to others. It was simply about staying alive long enough for something, anything, to change. He knew that drinking his own sweat was dangerous. He knew it provided almost no hydration at all. But the instinct to survive is powerful, and it often whispers solutions that logic refuses to accept. Daniel listened to that instinct because the alternative was death. So he pressed the soaked cloth to his lips and swallowed. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself help would come. But deep down, he understood a darker possibility, that the desert might not be finished with him yet. Most survival stories feature dramatic rescues, helicopters cutting through storms, teams of professionals tracking footprints through forests. Daniel's reality was far more brutal. No search team was coming. No one knew he was missing. Friends believed he was still on the road. The weather was clear, the skies quiet, and the desert so wide that one overturned Jeep was nothing more than a pin dropped on an ocean of sand. Days blurred together in a haze of heat and exhaustion. Daniel learned to move only at dawn and dusk to avoid draining what little moisture remained in his body. He rationed every movement as if each one cost him a fraction of his life. He wrapped himself under the Jeep at night, shivering as temperatures plunged. He whispered to himself to stay awake because he feared that if he fell asleep, he might not wake up again. And all the while, he drank what little sweat he could collect, every drop an echo of the body failing beneath him. Survival, he realized, was no longer a goal. It had become a negotiation between his will to live and the desert's will to take. People often imagine survivors as heroes, strong, unbreakable, fearless. But Daniel wasn't fearless. He was terrified every second. He wasn't unbreakable. He felt himself cracking mentally long before his body began to shut down physically. And he certainly didn't feel heroic. Most of his days were spent in silence, in pain, in humiliation, doing whatever he could just to see another sunrise. But this is the reality your audience needs to understand. Survival doesn't belong to the fearless. It belongs to the afraid. It belongs to the ones who tremble but keep moving anyway, to the ones who are ashamed of the things they had to do, but do them regardless. Because life is worth fighting for. Daniel's 9 days in the desert were not glamorous. They were not cinematic. They were not filled with clever tricks or improvised tools. They were filled with raw instinct, relentless heat, and a battle against a thirst so deep it bordered on madness. And yet somehow, he endured. This story isn't about how strong Daniel was. It's about how strong a person can become when the world strips everything else away. The desert had been brutal long before the Jeep flipped, but the crash turned brutality into something almost biblical. Witnesses weren't there to see it, yet anyone could imagine the violent choreography that took place. The tires losing traction on a patch of loose sand, the vehicle skidding sideways, the sudden drop over a hidden dune shoulder, and then the world turning upside down in a cyclone of dust, metal, and terror. When the Jeep finally stopped rolling, it lay tilted on its side like a broken animal. Inside, the man, who had set out simply to cross a stretch of desert road, was crumpled against the shattered window, his forehead bleeding, his ribs screaming with every breath. He didn't know how long he remained unconscious. Minutes, hours. The sun above didn't care about human measurements of time. When he finally stirred, his first breath tasted of dust and pain. Disoriented, he pushed against the broken door, coughing as sand crumbled down from the tilted ceiling of the Jeep. His mind felt wrapped in fog. The desert outside, shimmering with heat, looked unreal, like a painting smeared with gold and white. His throat burned with dryness. His tongue felt thick, clumsy. When he tried to move, a lance of pain streaked through his side. Probably cracked ribs, he thought. But the damage wasn't what terrified him most. What terrified him was the silence. No engine hums, no passing cars, no wind. Just the endless, smothering quiet of a place so empty it seemed capable of swallowing a man whole. He dragged himself out through the broken window, each movement slow and deliberate, leaving streaks of blood on the metal as he pulled himself free. Outside, the heat struck him with the weight of a hammer. It was the kind of heat that didn't simply press on the skin, but sank into the bones, as though the desert were trying to burn a person from the inside out. He staggered a few steps from the wreck before collapsing to his knees. He forced himself to take inventory: bruised but mobile legs, a gash across his temple, swelling ribs, a pounding headache, and dehydration already setting in at an alarming speed. His lips were cracked. His breath felt shallow. He reached instinctively for the water bottle that had been clipped to his bag, but it was gone. Thrown somewhere in the crash. He searched the area, crawling on hands and knees, but found only sand and debris. The truth settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He was alone in the desert, with no water. He returned to the Jeep, hoping, praying, that something inside had survived the crash. The glove box was half crushed, but he forced it open with a grunt, sending a spray of broken plastic across the floor. He found a flare, useless in daylight. A crushed first aid kit, a few tools, an empty plastic bottle he must have forgotten to refill days earlier. Everything seemed to taunt him, except for one unexpected find. A protein bar wedged behind the manual. His stomach growled violently at the sight of it. But he knew enough about survival to understand what would happen if he ate it without water. The energy needed to digest solid food would accelerate dehydration, not slow it. So he stared at the bar for a long moment before sliding it carefully back into the pocket of the door. A future temptation he wasn't sure he'd live long enough to face. The day grew hotter, pushing him back into the wreckage for what little shade it offered. He sat against the interior wall of the Jeep, wrapping his arms around himself despite the oppressive heat. Every breath felt like inhaling through a mouthful of needles. The desert outside shimmered with mirages, false lakes glistening in the distance, their surfaces dancing and inviting before dissolving into nothing. He wiped sweat from his forehead, only to realize how dangerous that habit was. Sweat was all he had left of the little water inside his body. Each drop that disappeared from his skin made survival less likely. He needed to stay calm, conserve strength, avoid panic, but the isolation pressed against him like a weight. The desert didn't need claws or teeth to kill. It simply waited for men to destroy themselves. He thought briefly of trying to walk. Try to find the road, try to reach some sign of life. But when he stood and looked out over the vast expanse, the idea evaporated. Miles of identical dunes stretched in every direction, no landmarks, no trails, no certainty. If he guessed wrong, as most people would, he would collapse hours into the journey, dying alone under a sun that didn't know the meaning of mercy. Staying with the Jeep was still the smarter choice. It provided shade, a signal, and the only shelter he had left. So he crawled back inside and used torn fabric from the seats to cover the exposed metal surfaces that radiated heat like stovetops. The simple act took nearly all his strength. Sweat poured down his temples. His vision blurred, yet he pressed on, battling every instinct that screamed at him to lie down and surrender. By midday, dehydration had started its cruel descent. His tongue felt like cracked stone. His muscles cramped. His heartbeat thudded unevenly, sometimes too fast, sometimes too soft. The air in the Jeep grew stifling, each breath a shallow fight for survival. He knew he was beginning to slip into dangerous territory. Even his thoughts began to fracture. Memories surfaced and drifted. His mother's voice, a hymn he hadn't heard since childhood, the feel of cool lake water splashing over him when he was 12. They felt like hallucinations, gifts and curses at the same time. He pressed his forehead against the steering wheel and whispered, "God, please." It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't a speech. It was a plea scraped from the bottom of a collapsing soul. The wind picked up slightly outside, swirling sand into thin golden streams. He watched through the broken window as the dunes shifted like moving creatures. He knew the desert wasn't alive, but it felt alive. It felt aware, as though it understood that it didn't need to be violent to win. It only had to wait. He tried to keep his breathing steady, tried to regulate his body temperature, but the shift from panic to clarity was slow and painful. Eventually, he forced himself to stretch out inside the Jeep, lying flat on the tilted floor, using the floor mat as insulation from the hot metal. He closed his eyes and listened to the distant hum of the wind. He could almost pretend it was the ocean. Almost. But as the afternoon passed, the heat became unbearable again. Waves of dizziness crashed over him. He clutched his ribs, trying to stop the shaking that overtook his body. He knew he was entering the early stages of heat exhaustion. He could feel his brain slowing, his awareness dimming, his thoughts unspooling like loose thread. He whispered again, not out of ritual, but instinct. "Lord, don't leave me." Whether God heard him or not, he didn't know. But the act of speaking the words kept him anchored, reminding him that he was still alive, still fighting, still trying to find meaning in a place where meaning dried up faster than footprints. As evening approached, the sun finally lowered in the sky, losing some of its merciless intensity. The man's body sagged with relief he hadn't earned but desperately needed. The first day wasn't over, not by a long shot, but surviving the daylight felt like surviving a battlefield. He gathered what little strength he had left and shifted into a position where he could watch the horizon. The sky turned orange, then pink, then purple. A beautiful transition, made cruel by context. Beauty without mercy, hope without guarantee. He swallowed, wincing at the pain it caused, and told himself that night would bring cold, and cold would bring suffering, but at least it wouldn't kill him as quickly as the sun. He pulled the floor mat over himself and closed his eyes, preparing for another kind of battle. The desert had taken much from him already, but it hadn't taken his will. Not yet. Night in the desert arrived not gently, but abruptly, like a door slamming shut. 1 hour before, the sand had been glowing with unbearable heat. Now it radiated cold as if the earth itself had reversed its pulse. The man shivered violently beneath the flimsy floor mat he had draped over his body. His cracked ribs throbbed. Every breath felt like inhaling broken glass. But the cold was still easier to endure than the day's heat. It sharpened him. It reminded him of the world beyond the dunes. It reminded him that he wasn't dead. Not yet. He lay curled inside the Jeep, listening to the night's subtle sounds, distant wind, shifting sand, and once a faint yipping cry that made his skin crawl. Coyotes, or perhaps jackals. Whatever they were, they sounded far too close. He slept in scattered fragments, never long enough to dream. Each time his eyes closed, he felt himself slipping towards something dangerous, something that tempted him to stay asleep forever. So he forced himself awake repeatedly, muttering words to keep his mind tethered. Stay here. Wake up. Not yet. By dawn, exhaustion had carved him out completely. His limbs felt hollow. His head throbbed with a slow, pounding ache. But when the first slice of sunlight cracked over the horizon, he sat up, knowing he had to prepare before the sun climbed overhead. He tore more fabric from the seats and stuffed them into gaps in the metal to create patches of shade. He gathered broken pieces of plastic, trying to fashion makeshift reflectors to deflect some of the heat. It was a desperate craftsman's work, but desperation bred creativity. As the second day unfolded, dehydration tightened its grip. His lips split open. His skin felt waxy. When he tried to speak, no words emerged, only air. He licked his cracked lips instinctively and immediately regretted it. The motion hurt, and the small amount of moisture evaporated instantly. He realized that his thoughts had begun to drift again, floating untethered in the scorching haze. He slapped his cheeks with trembling fingers, trying to jolt himself back to alertness. He needed to think. He needed to stay conscious. But the desert didn't care what he needed. It cared only for the slow unraveling of human will. By midday, he knew he had reached a turning point. If he didn't find water, any water, he wouldn't survive another 24 hours. The Jeep had no radiator fluid left to safely extract. There was no condensation. No shade substantial enough to prevent further loss. His body was failing. His hands trembled violently as he clenched them. And then, in one strange moment of clarity, like a flash of cold lightning through the fog, he understood the grim truth. The only source of moisture left to him was the moisture his own body could provide. It was an unthinkable solution, a last resort known only to those who had walked the edge between life and death. He stared down at his arms, glistening with sweat he could no longer afford to lose. Survival was not noble. It was not poetic. It was raw, primal, and terrifying. And as he wiped his forearm with trembling fingers and brought the beads of sweat to his lips, he felt both shame and relief collide inside him. The taste was metallic, earthy, unpleasant, but it eased the burning in his throat ever so slightly. He closed his eyes as he did it again and again, carefully wiping sweat from his chest, neck, forehead, anywhere he could. It wasn't hydration. Not really. It was merely slowing the inevitable. But slowing it meant one more hour alive. One more hour meant one more chance of rescue. By evening, he had accepted this disturbing routine as the only thread capable of keeping him tethered to life. The third night was colder than the first. Without the strength to gather more insulation, he huddled into the smallest ball his injured ribs would allow. His body shook so violently that he feared he would break something. His stomach cramped from emptiness. His mouth tasted like iron and dust. This time, hallucinations became more frequent. He heard voices speaking softly, as if family members had gathered just outside the Jeep. When he tried to lift his head, the voices faded. Then he heard footsteps, rhythmic, approaching, stopping. When he looked through the window, nothing was there but shifting dunes. The desert had begun to play with him. At dawn on the fourth day, he tried to stand. His legs buckled instantly. He fell to the sand, crying out as his ribs flared with pain. But he forced himself up again, using the Jeep's frame for support. He scanned the horizon. No movement, no roads, no glint of metal from a distant car. Still, he knew he couldn't lie in the Jeep forever. If he became too weak to crawl out, he wouldn't survive long enough for anything to save him. He walked around the Jeep slowly, stopping often to rest. Several times he almost fell. His vision blurred into strange patterns. Colors bled into each other. The sky seemed to pulse. It was then that he noticed something half buried in the sand a few meters away. Something metallic. Hope stabbed through him. He stumbled toward it, nearly falling onto his knees. But when he dug it out, his heart sank. It was just another piece of wreckage, a twisted panel torn from the Jeep's underside. Worthless. Yet he clung to it, not for its use, but because it reminded him that the crash had been real, and that reality might anchor him long enough to keep moving. He dragged it back to the Jeep, propping it against the sun to create additional shade. By day 5, the sweat on his skin had nearly stopped. His mouth was so dry it felt like sandpaper. His heartbeat fluttered irregularly, like a dying bird trapped inside his chest. He tried to pray, but even prayer felt heavy now. Words formed slowly, sluggishly. "Lord, I don't know if you hear me," but the rest crumbled. But he didn't stop trying. He kept whispering, if only to remind himself that he still existed, still had something within him capable of pleading for mercy. That night, when he lay down beneath the mat, he whispered once more, "Please, let me wake up." The desert answered only with silence. Yet he did wake up, barely. And on day 6, something strange happened. The sky looked different, not cooler, not clouded, but different. He felt as if the world had softened its edge just enough for him to breathe without agony. The wind brushed against his skin less harshly, his heartbeat steadied. He felt for the first time since the crash a faint whisper of strength creeping back into his bones. It was not enough. Not nearly enough, but it was something. And in the desert, something was everything. He sat up, steadying himself with trembling arms, and realized that despite everything, the crash, the sun, the hunger, the dehydration, he was still alive. A miracle or a punishment. He wasn't sure which, but he was still here. And that meant the desert hadn't finished with him yet. By the time the 3rd day dawned, the desert had shed any illusion of mercy. The sun rose like a hammer, slamming its heat across the dunes, and Daniel's body felt as if it had been wrung dry from the inside out. He moved slowly, unsteady, as though gravity had suddenly doubled. His tongue was swollen, his lips cracked wide open, and every breath burned with the sting of hot air scraping through his throat. Yet he forced himself upright again, gripping the dented frame of the overturned Jeep for support. Anyone watching from a distance might have thought he was simply standing to stretch or observe the horizon. But in truth he rose because he feared that if he allowed himself to stay on the ground even a moment longer, he might never get up again. Daniel scanned the landscape with a soldier's discipline, even though he had never served a day in the military. Everything in him had sharpened into instinct. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of shimmering heat waves, each one distorting the line between earth and sky. He looked for clouds, none. He looked for birds, none. He looked for any shape, any color, anything that wasn't sand or rock. Still nothing, but he refused to let despair tighten its grip around him. He reminded himself that humans had survived harsher places, worse odds, longer days. But they had water, a small voice whispered in his mind. He ignored it. His attempts to collect moisture had become increasingly desperate. The night before, he had set out the scrap of tarp again, hoping the desert air might grant him even a few drops of condensation. But when he checked it that morning, the tarp was bone dry, almost mocking him. He touched the surface anyway, as if his fingers could will moisture into existence. Nothing. He inhaled sharply, trying not to allow frustration to steal what little energy he had left. Then, reluctantly, he returned to the only source of hydration he had left, his own sweat. Every ounce counted, every drop mattered. He didn't think of the taste anymore. Survival didn't care about comfort. By midday, Daniel decided he couldn't stay beside the Jeep much longer, not if he wanted a chance at being found. Rescuers would search the roads first. He knew that. But what if the flip had scattered debris farther than he realized? What if something, anything, lay nearby that could help? So he began walking small circles around the crash site, marking each new radius with stones he gathered, creating a crude indicator of where he had already searched. Every step felt as if he were walking through thick mud rather than loose sand. His muscles trembled and his back ached from the harsh sun beating down on it without pause. Still, he pushed on. It was during one of these slow, deliberate sweeps that Daniel spotted something strange half-buried beneath a mound of sand. At first, he thought it might be a mirage, heat playing tricks on his eyes. But when he knelt, carefully, slowly, he uncovered the corner of a metal container. His heart kicked weakly, but hope flickered. He clawed at the sand with his weakened hands until he freed the object entirely. It was an old, rusted lunchbox, the kind a trucker or long-distance worker might carry. Its latch was stiff, almost fused shut. Daniel hesitated. What if it held nothing? What if it was empty or worse, full of sand? Still, he forced the latch open. Inside, he found something. Not salvation, but possibility. A small, sealed packet of saltine crackers, crushed but intact. A metal spoon, a faded photo of a smiling family, and a rolled-up bandana that smelled of dust and years. Daniel stared at the items for a long moment, overwhelmed by the realization that someone else had struggled through this place before him. Someone who had likely never returned for their belongings. The thought chilled him more deeply than the desert night ever had. He wasn't the first to be trapped out here, but he intended to be the first to walk out. He placed the crackers beside him, knowing the salt would only worsen his dehydration, but would provide just enough calories to keep his body from shutting down completely. He ripped the packet open slowly, cautiously, eating one tiny corner at a time. The crackers seemed to grow in his mouth, expanding into a dry paste that sucked away the remnants of moisture he barely had left. Still, he forced them down. Then he pressed the bandana against his face, inhaling the faint smell of fabric and oil. Something human, something familiar, something that reminded him that he wasn't entirely alone in this hostile world. Later, while resting against the overturned jeep, Daniel's thoughts drifted uncontrollably. Dehydration played tricks on his mind, blurring the line between memory and hallucination. He saw his father standing beside the hood of his first car, teaching him how to check the oil. He heard his sister laughing as she skipped stones across a lake they once visited every summer. He imagined his mother calling out from the porch, telling him dinner was ready. For a moment, these visions comforted him. But then they sharpened, too vivid, too real, and fear crept in. Hallucinations meant his mind was slipping, and once the mind goes, the body soon follows. Determined to remain present, he forced himself to focus on the jeep's shadow. It had become his clock, his compass, his silent companion. As afternoon melted into evening, the shadow stretched long across the sand, and Daniel knew night was coming. Night meant two things: blessed cold and terrifying darkness. He gathered the bandana, the spoon, and the empty lunchbox. Items that gave him no real advantage except psychological strength, and tucked them into the jeep's cabin. Then he used the remaining bits of fabric he had salvaged earlier to build another makeshift windbreak. The desert wind was fierce after sunset, sharp as broken glass, and he needed every barrier he could create. That night, as he curled beneath his tarp and listened to the unsettling stillness of the desert, Daniel whispered a prayer. Not for water, not even for rescue. He prayed for endurance, the strength to wake up the next morning and try again. To keep searching, to keep fighting, to keep believing that his story didn't end here, beneath an indifferent sky and dunes that swallowed hope like the tide. And as he drifted into a restless, fragile sleep, the desert watched him with ancient silence, indifferent yet unwilling to claim him, at least not yet. As the sun bled out behind the desert ridges, Daniel felt the temperature drop with a violence that shocked him every time. The desert had a cruel rhythm, burning by day, bone-numbing by night, and by the fourth evening, he no longer had the strength to brace for it. His body trembled uncontrollably as the heat fled the sand and the wind cut through his torn shirt like knives dipped in ice. He dragged himself back toward the shadow of his overturned jeep, now cracked open like a rusting skeleton, and collapsed beside one of the dented doors. Every bone in his body protested. His lips were split, swollen, almost black from dehydration. He wrapped his arms around his chest, trying to contain the shaking, but his muscles refused to obey. Night in the desert wasn't silence. It was dread, carried on a wind that felt like it could peel the last layer of life from him. The fourth night was always described by survivors as the point where hope fractures, but Daniel didn't have words for the kind of darkness he faced. It was absolute, not the absence of light, but the presence of something heavier, thicker, something that swallowed the stars and made the world feel hollow. He could hear the distant howl of coyotes, the shifting sand as something small scurried nearby, the eerie crack of cooling rocks. Every sound felt amplified, like the desert was leaning in closer, curious to see if he'd finally quit. His mind drifted in and out, slipping toward hallucinations. At one point, he saw a silhouette kneeling beside him, offering a bottle of water. Another moment he heard his mother calling his name. Both illusions dissolved into the cold air, leaving him face to face with the truth. He was utterly alone. He knew he needed water, but there was none left. Not even a drop in his makeshift containers. Survival manuals warned that the desert at night could be more dangerous than the day. But his body didn't care about warnings. His throat was raw. A desert inside the desert. His tongue felt thick, his heartbeat sluggish. He forced his mind to focus on the only source he had left: himself. He managed to fill a tiny scrap of plastic again with the moisture he could collect. Condensation from his breath, mixed with sweat scraped from his skin. It tasted like rust, dust, and fear, but he swallowed it anyway, his body shaking as the liquid hit his stomach. There was no dignity left in survival, not out here. As the wind grew harsher, Daniel crawled into the thin shadow cast by the jeep's belly. The metal smelled of oil and sand baked together by merciless daylight. He pressed his cheek to the cold metal to steady his breathing. He tried to sleep, but the desert refused him rest. Every few minutes he jolted awake, either from pain or from a sudden noise he couldn't identify. His injured ribs throbbed relentlessly. His right ankle was swollen to twice its normal size. His left wrist hung uselessly. Even breathing felt like a punishment. He kept whispering to himself, not prayers, not wails, just a simple sentence repeated with fading strength. Just make it to morning. Just make it to morning. It became a mantra carved between every heartbeat. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time became a hallucination of its own. His mind wandered to memories he hadn't touched in years. His first camping trip as a boy, the sound of rain on the roof of his childhood home. His father laughing during a barbecue. These memories didn't come in order. They crashed into each other, fragments of a life that felt impossibly far away from the desert floor. He didn't know if his mind was comforting him or preparing him to let go. The cold burrowed deeper under his skin. His hands went numb. His breathing became shallow and irregular. Even the pain began to fade, replaced by an eerie sense of quiet resignation. Then the noises started again. Closer this time. Slow, deliberate steps on sand. Daniel froze. The desert was full of animals that hunted at night, some out of curiosity, some out of desperation equal to his own. His heart pounded painfully against his ribs. He scanned the darkness, but his vision had become blurry, streaked with tears and exhaustion. Another step. And another. He reached instinctively for a piece of metal he had nearby, a jagged shard from the jeep's broken frame. It wasn't much, but he gripped it like a lifeline. When the creature finally appeared from the shadows, Daniel held his breath, only to release it in relief. It was a lone fox, small and cautious, its eyes reflecting the pale moonlight. It sniffed the air, then darted away. The encounter lasted seconds, but it was enough to jolt him awake. Enough to remind him he still cared about surviving. Strengthened by that flicker of adrenaline, Daniel tried to shift his body into a slightly more comfortable position. The movement was excruciating, sending bolts of pain through his side, but he forced himself through it. He needed every advantage he could find. He used his good hand to pull dry brush closer, fashioning a crude barrier against the wind. It didn't block much, but it lessened the freezing gusts that had been ripping through him. He found a patch of sand still faintly warm from the day and pressed his body into it, letting it absorb what little heat he had left. For a moment, he imagined he could hear the rhythmic crash of ocean waves instead of the whispering desert wind, his mind clinging to anything that felt alive. The night stretched on, each minute a battle fought in silence. Daniel's thoughts oscillated wildly. One moment he was calculating distances and possibilities. The next his mind produced images of cold water, overflowing glasses, clear lakes, ice cubes clinking in a drink. He tried to shake these visions, but they haunted him with ruthless persistence. Dehydration played tricks on the mind, but the worst part was that he knew they were tricks. He knew water wouldn't come. He knew rescue was still a distant, fragile hope. And yet, somewhere in the fog of exhaustion, he still clung to one belief. He had survived this long. He could survive another night. When the first hint of dawn began to brighten the horizon, Daniel felt a surge of relief so intense it almost hurt. The cold didn't disappear instantly, but the return of light felt like a hand reaching into his grave and pulling him up. He sat upright slowly, every joint stiff and aching. His body had survived the night, but barely. His face was pale, eyes sunken, movements sluggish. But he was alive, and daylight meant possibility. It meant a chance, however small, to find rescue, to find water, to keep going. He whispered a hoarse, "Thank you," to no one in particular, the words barely audible through cracked lips. As the sun finally climbed over the horizon, flooding the desert with golden fire, Daniel dragged himself out from under the jeep. A new day meant new suffering, but also new opportunities. He forced himself to stand, staggering under the weight of injuries and despair. But he didn't fall. The longest night was finally over. The desert hadn't taken him yet, and now, with his shadow stretching across the sand like a thin thread tying him back to life, he prepared himself for whatever the day demanded. Hope was still there, weak, battered, trembling, but alive. And as long as hope lived, so did he. When the fifth morning arrived, Daniel felt as though his body had become a stranger, an uncooperative, deteriorating vessel held together by sheer will. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and already its warmth pressed against the desert floor like a warning. He forced himself to stand, his legs trembling violently beneath him. His ankle sent sharp pulses of pain up his leg with every shift of weight, but he refused to let himself sink back down. From where he stood, the desert expanded endlessly in every direction, an ocean of sand and rock where hope could easily disappear. But he had survived another night, and that meant something. He scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of movement, any sign of human life, even a glint of metal. There was nothing, but he remembered something from the survival training he'd read years earlier. If rescue didn't come to you, sometimes you had to leave enough signs behind that rescuers could find you. He dragged his body around the wreck once more, checking for anything he might have missed during his dazed days crawling in circles. Most of the supplies had been destroyed in the rollover, shredded by impact, eaten by the desert, or scattered somewhere he no longer had the strength to search for. But beneath a piece of bent metal that he hadn't bothered to lift before, he found what looked like the remains of his emergency toolkit. The container was crushed, but when he strained to pry it open with one good hand, a few small treasures spilled into the sand. A cracked signaling mirror, a half-melted candle, and a useless lighter with the flint worn down. He held the mirror up to the sun. The reflection was faint, unreliable. But it was something. His heart beat a little faster. If he could get high enough ground, he could try signaling aircraft. Most search and rescue flights tracked along predictable paths. It was the best idea he'd had in days. The nearest slope wasn't tall, but it looked impossibly far. Sweat was already gathering along his brow, even though the sun had barely risen. He took a deep breath, wiped his face, and started moving. Every step felt like it was costing him a piece of himself. His ribs screamed, his ankle throbbed, and his throat felt like it was shrinking. He stumbled often, falling hard, catching himself with his bad wrist, forcing himself to rise again even when every fiber of his body begged him to stop. The desert had become a test of willpower, and each moment he continued was a rebellion against the landscape that had tried to claim him. After nearly half an hour of dragging, limping, and half-crawling, he finally reached the base of the ridge. The climb looked steep, the rocks unstable, but stopping wasn't an option. He pressed forward. The ascent was brutal. Loose stones slid beneath his soles, sending him backward more than once. His vision blurred, darkened, then snapped back into focus in painful flashes. He clung to the rocks, pulling himself upward inch by inch, relying on instinct more than strength. His breath rasped in his chest, shallow and irregular. By the time he reached the halfway point, he almost slipped, his hand giving out, his foot sliding. But he pressed his body against the warm rock face until the dizziness passed. He whispered to himself, not out of madness, but determination. "You're almost there. Keep moving." He emerged onto the ridge with the sun now fully above the horizon, and for a moment he allowed himself to collapse forward, pressing his forehead into the gravel. The world spun. His pulse hammered. But he had made it. From the top, the desert unfolded in an endless tapestry of yellows, reds, and muted browns. He could see farther than he ever had before, rolling dunes, dry riverbeds, distant rock formations that shimmered in the rising heat. And then, a flicker, something metallic, glinting from miles away. It might have been a vehicle, or debris, or even just an illusion caused by heat waves. But that small, distant sparkle was enough to reinvigorate him. He took the signaling mirror, angled it toward the sun, and directed the reflection toward the open sky. His hand shook so violently that he had to use both hands to steady the mirror against his chest. The reflected light flashed weakly, barely visible even to him. He adjusted the angle again and again, sweeping the flare of light across the horizon like a dying lighthouse. But the desert wind began to pick up. Hot air whipped across the ridge, throwing sand into his eyes and stinging his skin like needles. He kept signaling, refusing to let go, even when the mirror slipped from his grasp once and nearly tumbled off the ridge. He caught it at the last second, slicing his palm on the broken edge. Blood rolled down his wrist, but he barely felt it. He kept signaling, again and again, every flash of light a scream for help. Every shake of his arm a reminder of how little time he had left. Minutes passed, or maybe it was longer. The sun climbed higher, draining strength faster than he could replace it. His legs gave out, and he fell to his knees, still clutching the mirror. His breaths came in weak, uneven gasps. Then his arms slumped. The mirror dropped onto the sand. He closed his eyes. He didn't pass out, but he hovered dangerously close to the edge of losing consciousness entirely. Then, a sound. A distant, low hum. At first, Daniel thought it was his mind again, conjuring imaginary noises like it had nights before, but the hum grew louder, deeper. A vibration rolled through the air and down into his bones. His eyes snapped open. He lifted his head with every ounce of remaining strength, and there it was. Not a hallucination this time. A helicopter, small, white, probably from a local rescue team, approaching from the far side of the desert. His heart kicked violently against his ribs. He reached for the mirror, but his hand shook so badly he dropped it twice. On the third attempt, he managed to angle it toward the rising helicopter, sending frantic flashes of light across the open sky. The helicopter hesitated, slowed, tilted slightly. It saw him. Relief hit him so hard he almost collapsed. The helicopter changed direction, moving toward the ridge where Daniel knelt. He waved both arms weakly, tears blurring the scene into streaks of light and color. The helicopter circled once, likely scanning for safe landing terrain before lowering itself to the flattest section of the ridge. Dust exploded outward as the rotors sliced the air. Daniel shielded his face. A rescue worker leaped out, sprinting toward him through the sandstorm. The man's voice was muffled by the helicopter noise, but the urgency in his movements was unmistakable. When he reached Daniel, he placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You're safe now," the rescuer said loudly, leaning in close so Daniel could hear. Those words shattered something inside Daniel, something he'd held rigid for days. His body went limp as tears ran freely down his dust-caked cheeks. The rescue worker half-carried, half-supported Daniel toward the helicopter. Daniel's legs dragged behind him, too weak to step. When they reached the cabin, another medic helped lift him inside. The moment Daniel felt the cool, shaded interior, his body reacted with a mix of shock and overwhelming relief. A bottle of water appeared at his lips, and though they warned him to sip slowly, his trembling hands nearly snatched it away. The water tasted like life reborn, icy, clean, impossibly perfect. His eyes filled again as he swallowed. The medics worked quickly, securing him to a stretcher, checking his vitals, applying cold compresses to his forehead and chest. He heard fragments of their conversation. Severe dehydration, multiple fractures, but he's still conscious. When the helicopter lifted off, Daniel looked down at the desert one last time. The ridge he had crawled up, the ruins of his jeep, the endless waves of sand that had nearly claimed him, and he realized something profound. He had won. As the helicopter carried him towards safety, Daniel closed his eyes, not from exhaustion this time, but from peace. He knew recovery would be long. He knew he would carry the scars, physical and emotional, for the rest of his life. But he also knew something else. He had survived the impossible. He had pushed past every limit, every fear, every cruel test the desert had thrown at him. The sun warmed his face as he drifted in and out of consciousness, and for the first time since the crash, the warmth felt gentle instead of brutal. The desert receded behind him, shrinking into the horizon. And Daniel, bruised, broken, but undeniably alive, finally allowed himself to believe in tomorrow. Daniel's 9-day ordeal in the desert became more than a survival story. It became a living testimony of unbreakable resilience and divine mercy. When he was finally rescued, the sun-scarred man who stumbled into the arms of his rescuers was not the same person who had set out days earlier, with confidence and certainty. His body was weak, but something inside him had been strengthened beyond measure. He survived by drinking his own sweat, rationing every remaining ounce of strength, and clinging fiercely to the belief that God had not abandoned him. Not even in a place where life itself seemed impossible. The desert had stripped him of comfort, control, and certainty, yet it had given him something far greater: clarity, humility, and an unshakable awareness of God's presence in the darkest hours. In the weeks after his rescue, Daniel found himself replaying the moments when he thought death was certain. The endless dunes, the burning silence, the nights filled with dread. But every time he remembered the worst of those moments, he also remembered something else. A whisper, a nudge, a peace that did not make sense. He realized that while his body had been in the desert, his spirit had been cradled in the hands of the one who created the sands themselves. What he once interpreted as sheer luck, he now understood as divine intervention. The odd dreams, the inexplicable reassurances, the sudden strength to stand when his legs should have failed. All of it was God breathing hope into a man on the edge of death. And from that moment on, Daniel vowed to never again take lightly the God who rescued him. Today, Daniel shares his testimony wherever he can, sometimes in small groups, sometimes with strangers, sometimes in quiet one-on-one conversations when someone needs encouragement the most. He tells them that survival isn't just about what the body can endure, but what the heart can hold onto. He tells them that miracles don't always look like parted seas or thunderous voices. Sometimes they look like a faint breeze in a silent desert, a sudden instinct that saves your life, or the strength to take one more step when everything inside you says, you can't. Daniel was saved so he could help others find their way out of their own deserts, whether emotional, spiritual, or physical. And his message is always the same. You are never alone. Even when the world feels empty, God is closer than your own breath.